morning, Paul.
Good morning.
Hayre, right? Did I pronounce that correctly?
Yeah.
Hayre, okay,
just like
Paul
Hayre.
Hayre.
Yeah, very easy.
Yeah, and thank you so much for your time to have this conversation with us with MIT RIP from Indonesia. So Paul Hayre is the Executive Director of Harvard GRID. What's your story that you now sit on in the Executive Director of Harvard GRID?
All right. As the world works in many ways, I would say it was largely a happenstance, but by nature, I've sort of loved the early and growth stage problem. And the engineering school here in collaboration with the Office of Technology Development sort of came to an idea that there's lots of Harvard in science and engineering that has impact in the world, but the opportunity to help shape and lift more ideas from Harvard labs out to market. If they had a little bit more attention, a little bit more wherewithal, and a little bit more formal organization. So that was sort of the founding thesis for the GRID. And it turns out, as an alum of the university and living here in the Boston area, I have lots of friends that work here. So I learned of the opportunity, and someone said, have the perfect day job for you. I was already working on another device, but my friend pulled hard enough to where I was able to look at it and say, that is essentially the perfect dream job for me. Come here and build a new accelerator of sorts to help lift more ideas from labs to market.
I see. Is GRID an abbreviation of something? What is GRID?
You know, that is a common question. GRID is not an acronym. It doesn't stand for anything, but it harkens to the electrical grid. And the reason that the aspects of the grid that we wanted to sort of allude to are the fact that there are many nodes that are interconnected by many paths. So it's a very well-connected network. And that was sort of the idea, is that in order to shape, especially tough tech ventures, it's not a single-player sport, it's a team sport. And so it's this idea of bringing together a lot of ingredients, connecting in novel ways to get more lift.
Right, okay. So as you can see right now, we're actually in this new building called the Harvard Science and Engineering complex.
Right.
And so it's so green. There is a lot of gardens and everything, and it's a new building, right?
Yes.
Can you maybe tell us a little bit about the history of the Harvard Engineering School? What year was it built? And
yes. Well, it's existed in its current format. We call it SEAS, the School of Engineering and Applied Sciences, and SEAS exists in that sort of incarnation with that name for about 15 years. So in that sense, maybe relatively young.
Wow.
But Harvard has done science and engineering almost from its founding. So it's offered courses in the harder sciences from, like I said, for the most part, from the very beginning.
Yeah.
But this building in particular, we've had classes and offices and activity in it only for about 5 years now. It was under construction over a long time. There was a pause, but this was built to be a place where there could be natural intersections, which I think is a great strength of Harvard engineering across many disciplines, but also a place where you walk in the morning and you're inspired by what it is, how it was built, sort of thoughtfulness that went into it, and just the...
That's pretty much what I did every morning.
Yeah.
I live really nearby, and this is my favorite park around here.
Maria, that's exactly right. Even walking up to it, when you look up and you see what it is, and then you walk into the building, it's hard not to have your mind sort of opened and inspired to do great things and to see how the world can look different thanks to your work.
But wow, 15 years, compared to Harvard, which is basically the oldest university in the US, and probably in the one of the oldest universities in the whole world.
Top few, yeah.
It's pretty much very, very, very baby, right? In its baby stage.
Certainly the way the engineering school looks today, you can call it that, and I think also that was part of the thesis of what the major components of how we wanted to found the GRID, is that we may not have the numerical breadth that some of the other large engineering schools have. We have roughly, let's call it 110 full-time faculty. To give you an idea, MIT might be somewhere in the 700 to 800 science and engineering focused faculty. So not quite an order of magnitude, but not far from it either. But I think where the GRID focuses its effort is what the real strengths are of Harvard engineering, which is intersectionality. The fact that we have sort of maybe if not one of the world-class humanities programs in the world in the context of that. Because it's launching ideas is not an electrical engineering sport. It's not a mechanical engineering sport. It's sort of the intersection of science, of biology, of chemistry,
Oh, okay.
of human interactivity, right? Human
Wow.
interface. So that's where a lot of
So
engineering goes.
I see. And what would be like the main, I don't know, let's say like main topics of research of the Harvard Engineering School? Is there like maybe, I don't know, top 3, let's say?
Yeah,
What are you
I won't do
working on?
justice, I'm afraid. But I'll tell you some of the things that, like recently, that we've had a lot of focus on. We'll have Mass Robotics as an organization here in the Boston area that is sort of a quasi-state focal point for the idea of innovation in robotics. And Harvard, we do a lot in the area of microrobotics and exoskeletons as example, plus prosthetics, neuroprosthetics, as well as exoprosthetics. So sort of as well as augmentation of human mobility using robots, as well as some of the more traditional disciplines of robots, arms, motion, gripping, so those kinds of areas. So sort of a broader area in robotics.
So like medical tech as well.
Yes, that's right. So we,
application.
Yes, right. And so it's a perfect example of intersectionality, which is, I think, again, what I'm particularly proud of what we do here at the engineering school. But then there's also traditional material sets that are sort of ushering in the next wave of what computing and electronics will look like, how they operate, how they can be much more efficient and consume less power. So there's a lot of material science work, developing materials that have great impact. Lots of novel devices which end up, impacting disciplines like healthcare, and so on. So, it's a broad set for such a small community.
Wow. Okay. Very inspiring. And so, Paul, I just want to ask you as well. I think Harvard GRID is also like the office which deals with the research commercialization in Harvard, basically, right? And so, like, can you tell us a little bit about like the routes, and like the paths that research labs can go from like their research stage into like commercialization? Like, what is happening and how many paths there is?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, the GRID is a collaboration between our Office of Technology Development and the School of Engineering. So. Part and parcel is the OTD, as we call it, the Office of Tech Development. And the reason we call it tech development versus tech licensing, as an example, is that, we have people that have a similar pedigree to me and that they have done lots of other career experiences before joining the office, including entrepreneurship. So that provides for a great partnership in not just filing a patent, but the idea of figuring out sort of use cases, applications, figuring out what are the right ways and to think about creating protection of ideas that are generated in labs. And so that's so the school here in the engineering, we work very closely with colleagues in the technology development office, really side by side, while research is being conducted, as we're thinking about how to not just protect it, but also how to take it out. So it's a very close relationship. Which and so I think maybe a little bit by means of distinction, it's a lot less transactional the way it might be at some other places, and that's the reason that we think of that office and its function more as tech development versus tech licensing.
What did you mean that it's less transactional?
In the sense that when a researcher might have an idea that he or she thinks could be patented, sort of many that have the function of licensing sort of look at that as figuring out what the patent should be, based on the mechanism, and then filing the patent and getting the patent sort of issued. And that's good and important. But I think thinking more broadly about use-inspired cases and how that sort of changes the claims, as an example, that might end up in patents, but then also further downstream in terms of how you might connect with parties in the marketplace and how to get ideas out of the lab. There's a bit more nuance in thinking about the development of those technologies. So that's sort of the distinction, say, between transaction of a patent versus really developing a technology, but more importantly, developing its idea and for impact.
Oh, okay. So like the impact and the goal is kind of like what drives everything. Is that what you mean?
Yes.
Who set this, like, this is like our big mission, our big goals? Who set that agenda?
Well, I think the best way to answer that question is to think about sort of what the founding thesis of the GRID was. And it was an idea that was a collaboration between our tech development office as well as our dean.
So it's like a dialogue, basically.
Exactly. That's right.
Between the two offices.
That's right. Again, in the spirit that tough tech ideas and for real impact, it's a team sport. So, the idea that multiple organizations at Harvard came together and said, this is something that we want to do more of, and the question is, how do we do it? And it's going to take people from different organizations at the same table.
Okay. Also, can you tell us a little bit about the paths of commercialization? Because so like, if I'm not mistaken, so there are basically two paths. The first one would be, it's a research lab, and they register their own patent, and then they go by themselves, like they just finish the relationship with Harvard, and they just becoming a startup. But like the other paths will be supported by Harvard, it's a Harvard startup. Is that even possible? What are the paths?
Yeah, no, I think you're sort of, notably, so we talked about licensing and how do you get a patent and then sort of launching as a startup. But this idea of a Harvard startup is something I think that, we, as I notice and I see how my colleagues in the Office of Technology Development interact with these ideas, in that spirit of transaction, in many cases, once a patent is issued, and a startup is launched, as an example, or it's licensed to a larger company, oftentimes the university might, step back and spend less time with those ideas, because then they revert back to an earlier point in that life cycle. But what I've seen, and what I'm particularly proud of also in how we approach these things, is that there's an ongoing relationship, because those ideas, in order for them to have impact, it's not throwing ideas over chasms and over walls and expecting things to sort of then germinate and take root and have impact that way. Is that there's chasms. There's you've heard of valleys of death, and those exist at multiple points in the lifetime of an idea. And so relationship, there's a continuity of a relationship too. And I see my colleagues in OTD how they spend more time with the teams that are out in the world that are using these ideas and these patents and these intellectual property patents, a portfolio, to do good, but also they continue that effort of figuring out how can we help, how can we support, what connections do we continue to bring to the table, or what else can the university do to see that ideas from here actually do have that use intended impact. Okay.
You mentioned about the Valley of Death.
Yeah.
And that's exactly I think that's really the soft spot of the deep tech startups, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because I think no deep tech startups will survive if they go out by themselves and they just follow the the usual Series A, Series B, Series C of the venture capital. It has to be supported either by maybe government grant or by university, right?
Yes.
And what does Harvard do to support these startups, which is in their Valley of Death?
Yes. I mean, there are, and Marina, I don't want to also mislead. I mean, there are constraints in the sense that, Harvard is an academic institution. Our focus is research. Yeah. And so we're not in the, we're not a venture capital firm, and we're, we need to stay on the sidelines when enterprises, shift from being research and academic focused into commercial. But that said, as I mentioned, these are still, it's a portfolio of patents in the Harvard system. So it certainly behooves the university just to make certain that that work and that research and those ideas, can go out and get legs. So that's what, that's how I would characterize in the context of the relationship. But particularly in the Valley of Death, when ideas launch, especially in tough tech, which is what we focus on, right? And this idea of science and engineering. This Valley of Death means that oftentimes ideas are launched with venture capital funding when the science is de-risked, but maybe there's continuing or ongoing engineering. So that means that the exact shape of what the product might look like, or the exact shape of how it gets into the hands of a customer, or the exact fit and how a customer will use that and plug that into their systems and protocols and do what they do for their customers in turn, may not yet be resolved. And that often is what sort of creates what we call that Valley of Death, is that continuing to do that final sort of engineering until you get that product market fit, more resonant, and then you sort of figure out how to expand it into a much larger customer base. So that's where we continue to play a role, and largely through the Office of Technology Development, is to, to see that, how does that work need to change? How do we continue to have relationships with the research teams here, so, to see what other and ongoing ideas develop, to sort of continue to finesse and nuance ideas that may be useful or relevant to licenses that are already out into the market.
I see. Well, you clearly mentioned that, of course, Harvard does not give venture capital funding. But a research grant, is it like something that Harvard maybe cooperate with the government agency, etc.?
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
I see. Yeah.
And without splitting hairs, that want to there is the Harvard Management Company, which handles the endowment. So those are all separate things. Those are certainly makes investments in VCs. But do a lot of, and also some direct investment. But again, I don't want to get lost in the nuance there. But sort of the teams that I've been talking about don't get involved in venture capital funding or commercial activities. But to your question, so the GRID Accelerator is one of the granting mechanisms, and there's several. In the Office of Technology Development, we have a Blavatnik Biomedical Accelerator, which invests in sort of life science-oriented research projects.
I see.
We have the GRID Accelerator, which focuses on the physical and applied sciences, and then we also have an engineering. And now there's a relatively new joint Salata Institute and Office of Technology Development climate translational fund. So these are mechanisms to sort of identify research threads that have the potential for a sort of commercial or use-inspired application, as I've used that term now many times. And when we identify, it's the idea of sort of de-risking them. So how do you support researchers when they want to see their ideas have impact, sort of de-risk that science piece that I talked about, so that they could be eligible, as an example, if I could use that word, like eligible for external funding or support or pull or license from the marketplace. Wow, so that's the lens by which we look at ideas in terms that might be eligible for grant funding, because these are more translationally oriented grants, which is how do we get ideas de-risked enough to where they can find a home or find pull from the marketplace at the end of a year.
Can you elaborate a little bit, like how do you de-risk the risk from the startup?
Yeah, for example, do we further characterize, if it's a material, do we need to further characterize it so that there is a customer in the world that can say, you know what, I see exactly how that might fit into what I do and how it might enhance a project that I'm working on or enhance my products that I've been
And they might be the industry or the government, probably, right? Government agencies.
Yes, that's right. If, any sort of entity on the sort of external world, if I may, outside the sort of the four walls.
Like the off-takers.
That's right, exactly. that you want to sort of get it to a point where an off-taker can say, I can see a clear line of sight. Yes, exactly. I need this. That's a great way to put it. There's a clear line of sight of how that might fit in and improve some process, some idea, some product, or some service today in a way that is meaningful. So that's the idea of de-risking, and that's how we sort of think about it. So that whatever the thorns might be, we sort of follow those down a little bit with these grants. And again, that could be further characterization of a product. It could be like something that might have a medical application, thinking about sort of figuring out what a regulatory path might be, or what a payment or reimbursement path may be, and we may need to work with external parties to figure those things out.
This is really amazing to hear from you, because actually, like, part of the results that we get from the MIT RIP program, our conclusion for our own country, Indonesia, is that we actually need to gather the off-takers, whether they're like industry or the government agencies. And how difficult was it for you to find these industries and the ministries?
Well, I wouldn't say that we have figured that out, any more than any of the sister organizations you might find at other universities. And so far, we've been sort of creating really a bespoke system, in that sense that when we identify projects, or there's students or faculty that would like support in their projects, we then sort of cast a wide net to our networks and see where there's good resonance. So, Marina, this is something that we're thinking about, which is how do we, and I don't want to say institutionalize because that sounds very bureaucratic, but how do we systematize this idea of making those connections?
Okay, exactly.
But like you said,
and is this an ongoing process?
Yes, absolutely. Okay. Like notably, in the spirit of it takes a village. We've spent a lot of time on this idea of bringing people together. So intersectionality of discipline is what we've talked about, but also the intersectionality of people, that you need people with different skill sets and aptitudes that bring different experiences to the table to launch an idea, because you need to understand markets, how to get to markets, how to characterize what the value prop is, so you can communicate in the language of a customer. And that's as important as understanding what your technology is and the mechanism. So these are skill sets that may not be, and likely are not, in one person.
Wow, we will be very much interested in collaborating with you. I mean, in Indonesia we have like industries, ministries. We would love to have all those conversations, and relationships being
Yes.
opened.
Well, and I'm glad you focused on the role of government too. It's often one of the players that's left out as you think
Yes.
about building an
Yeah.
ecosystem, which
Yeah.
it sounds like as you're putting your ideas together.
Yeah.
The government is an important factor, but
Yeah.
having all these players at the table
Mhm.
and this idea of physicality, if I can use that word, I'm not sure it's a real word, but this idea of being at the same table.
Yes,
The world has
exactly.
learned how to communicate digitally, but at the same time, this idea of being at the same table, a lot of invention happens when you bring people together
Yeah.
and sort of have a common goal. So that is a
Okay.
big focus of the grid as well.
Paul, just one last question. You mentioned about, again, value of death. And usually, like grant funders or any type of funders, they need to be very patient, when it comes to tough tech. It's not just a question of
Yes.
waiting for 1 to 2 years or 5 years, which most venture capital is working on, but it can be 10 or 20 years,
Yes,
right?
absolutely.
Okay, wow. So is that like the time length that you're actually looking for when you're supporting this tough tech and also?
Oh, goodness. Just to repeat what you said, it
Yeah.
could be 5 to 10 years.
Oh, okay.
And, I know there's many folks in my network and dear friends that, have a startup. It was an overnight success over 10 years.
Okay.
It's sort of a little
10
bit
years
of
is overnight
yes,
success.
Exactly.
Wow.
Yes. They're always overnight successes, but it only took 10 years. That
Okay.
one overnight, it was 10 years later.
Yeah.
But your point is right on, is that it's hard to anticipate what the extent of that is. And
Yeah.
so this idea of this is what entrepreneurs need to do well to be successful. And this is, as you look at sort of a profile of successful entrepreneurs, which is this fluidity in program, this idea of that at any one point, when things are going wrong, which they inevitably do, it's being able to figure out what needs to change and quickly being able to make those adjustments.
Okay.
Really, that is the art of entrepreneurship, is that, this valley of death, especially in tough tech, is almost inevitable. And the idea is, I use the term bespoke as we think of the programs that we create and bring to the table when we have projects here, but it's the same thing, which is if an item is broken, who are the people that now need to be at the table?
Is there a point of time where you said, okay, like this has been going on forever and it's not going to work out, we're just going to close the research? Is there any such thing?
Well, so the research focus, that always rests solely in the hands of our faculty
Okay.
and principal investigators.
Okay.
So when we say close focus, but the grid as a translational engine is that these grants have a lifetime. They're usually
Wow.
a grant that's focused on a year,
Amazing.
right? So that's not to say that, we're going to have everything figured out and we're going to launch this idea in 1 year, but that is to say that's the goal.
Yeah.
The goal of our grants is to say, how can we de-risk this idea so that in 1 year it should be eligible? And it's not a perfect art, or it's not a perfect science, however you wish you would like to describe it. But that certainly is the goal. But there are many projects where even at the end of 1 year, there's still additional work that needs to be done before, to use that prior analogy, like you're able to sort of reduce the thorns that would inhibit it from getting sort of lift by
Okay.
some pull in the marketplace.
Okay, great. Okay, wow. So thank you so much, Paul Hayre, the Executive Director of Harvard GRID. We covered so many things in just a really short time about like how Harvard GRID works and how research commercialization works at Harvard Engineering School, especially.
Delighted,
Yes.
Marina. Thank you for the invitation to have this conversation. And I learned as much from each of these as anything from the questions you asked and
Oh,
what
okay.
you don't know, would love to speak about.
Yes, great. Thank you so much, Paul.
Pleasure.